Welcome to Migdal Dialogues, a podcast from Yeshivat Migdal HaTorah. This is Jonathan Ziering, and I'm here with Rabbi Aryeh Wasserman, a Rebbe and Dean of Students at Migdal HaTorah.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on the show. My name is Aryeh Wasserman. As Rabbi Ziering said, I'm the Dean of Students at Migdal HaTorah, and I've been at Migdal for the past several years, and it's a pleasure to be here.
What I want to talk about with you today is one of the unique aspects of the experience at Migdal. And anyone who looks at our website will see that over the last few years, as a yeshiva, we've taken unique trips. 3 years ago, we went to Switzerland and went to CERN, to the Giant Hadron Collider. And then for the last 2 years, we've gone to Dubai. And this year, we're going to Bahrain. Aryeh, you are the organizer of these trips. So I want to talk with you about what it is that you see that's important in these trips and the role of travel and experience in education. So can you just start us off by telling us, why do you enjoy travel so much, and why do you think it's so central to the educational experience at Migdal?
Okay, so I'll start, I guess, with a little background about how I came into this position. When I came to Migdal, it was kind of an ambiguous role to kind of just join the administration team. My first year, as I was getting my feet wet and exactly finding myself in terms of how would I fit in the administration, we were approached by generous sponsors who, out of a conversation with the Rosh Yeshiva, decided that they were going to sponsor the inaugural international trip to Geneva to visit CERN.
We should probably explain what CERN is for our listeners who don't know. CERN is the European Center for Nuclear Research, by the way, and the home of the Giant Hadron Collider.
Right. So in CERN, the main attraction is the Large Hadron Collider, which is the largest particle accelerator in the world. And one of the things we focus on in the yeshiva is philosophy and physics and metaphysics. The Rosh Yeshiva gives a shiur on these topics. And the opportunity to go to a place where the top researchers in the world are discovering the origins of the universe by, again, the Large Hadron Collider basically smashes subatomic particles at high speeds to kind of reenact the moments right before the Big Bang. That was a very powerful experience and something that the Rosh Yeshiva felt was pedagogically in line with the yeshiva, so the sponsors made it happen.
We were both there together, and it really was an amazing experience at many levels, and we brought Professor Schroeder to talk about some of the Torah and science aspects of it. But since you're much more involved in the actual planning of it, I wanted to ask you, what is it about traveling there and actually being present in CERN that adds educationally, or does it add educationally, and not just experientially, beyond what we could have done in the yeshiva or in the classroom?
Yeah, it's one thing to read about it, learn about it, and kind of just talk about it theoretically, but when you actually go and see it, and especially, it leaves an imprint, leaves an impression on the student. When you go to a place where, again, you can't just walk into CERN. We had to make reservations 8 months in advance. It's top-level stuff. To have that experience really can imprint the knowledge and the education that is going on in the Beis Medrash for future years. And it's not the same just to talk about it. So all the students, when they walked out of that trip, they were just blown away, not just by the cool factor, but wow, Hashem's world is really incredible, and the science behind it and the wisdom behind God's world is incredible. And you really see it when you go there in person.
At this point, all of our yeshiva guys know this, but our listeners might not. But this isn't just something that you do for the yeshiva, and we'll come back to maybe some of the other trips that we've done, but this is something you also do in your own life. You are a, dare I say, obsessive traveler and credit card point aficionado, which allows you to travel. Do you think that this is something that's beneficial only in the context of a yeshiva trip where we plan it educationally, or do you find that simply travel and the experience enriches your religious life? And can it do that for everyone, or should it do that for everyone? Should it be part of the way that we embrace the world?
Look, it's not for everyone, but I'll tell you personally, again, we got a little bit sidetracked in terms of why I got into this role. So let's take a step back and then I'll answer the question. Once we started planning the CERN trip, it was my first year in the yeshiva, and we hired a company to kind of plan the trip for us. And then my background was, as you said, I've been for the past bunch of years one of those like Dan Deals type of people trying to find out how to manage the credit card gaming system, obviously in a legit and legal way, but
Thank you for clarifying that
No
one.
problem. But I'm saying there's a lot of, for someone like me who's a rabbi who doesn't have a large salary, so to go to some
Not
of these.
that we're complaining.
No, but I'm just saying that some of these trips would be not in the budget for me. So being able to kind of do the credit card sign up bonuses and get all these points and basically go on these trips for pretty much for free allowed me to travel to places that I wasn't going to be able to on my salary. Through that, I began looking at the trip and the expenses and whatever, and I said, oh, well, I think we could do this a little better. I think we can do this a little cheaper. And I ended up being involved in a bunch of the planning for that first year. Through that, I kind of earned my way into for the future trips, which I ended up taking up on my own, and we saved not only we saved a significant amount of money for the yeshiva. That's how I got into this role, and now I basically have taken it on completely. But in terms of answering the question, for me, traveling is an incredible experience because you get to see the incredible world that God has created. So some of the places I've traveled to on points is I've been to Hawaii, where I went with my wife. We went to several of the islands. One of the places that we went to was the Big Island, where we saw flowing lava. It was just incredible. I said a bracha. It was literally...
Which bracha?
I happened to say Osa Masa Bereshis. That's how I felt at the time. That's what I felt was proper. It was literally seeing Masa Bereshis happen. Others would say that probably is not the right bracha, but that's the one I felt at the time.
I think we did that when we were in CERN. We did that. We divided into two groups. There were those of us who were not sleeping on the plane, who Reb Chaim Ozer led in a bracha when they saw the Alps from the plane, and there were those of us like myself who took advantage of the plane ride to sleep. So when we got to Switzerland and we were actually under the Alps, I led the second group in saying the bracha. But I think we talked about at the time at the power of experience and the way in which bracha show that Chazal understood the religious power of experience, of actually being present in places where you see the greatness of God, and that's what bracha really do. And I think that, I agree with you that is one of the things that I encourage people to see in all parts of their life, and we got the opportunity to show the students live at the Alps, and it's not surprising to me that you do the same on your own trips.
Yeah, so another example of this is we hiked a mountain in Hawaii called Haleakala, which is this it's incredible, it's almost 14,000 feet, I think. We drove up for sunrise, and we're standing there on top of the clouds, that's how high we were, watching sunrise from above. And there were, I would say, maybe 50 to 100 people there for this experience. And it was like a 2-hour, 3-hour drive up in the dark. It was very scary. And then we get there, and my wife's looking around, and there's all these couples and romantic, and it's a beautiful save the moment. And for me, it was, yes, I get to daven Hanetz, watching above the sunrise, right? And it was an incredible, religious, powerful moment for me. If you can connect through nature and you realize that God is the organizer behind this and how small and insignificant we are in that face, it's really a powerful religious experience for me. So those types of experiences, even though I go to Dot Minyan all the time and I'm very pro Minyan and organized structure of tefillah and all those different things, some of my most powerful tefillot were in those type of moments, in these incredible natural habitat environments where I feel the awe of God in his amazing world.
It's interesting you bring up Hanetz because when I was in yeshiva myself, not teaching, I remember once hearing a shir by Rav Medan where he pointed out that if you look at the source, the pasuk that's quoted in at least some of the sources in Chazal for the value of davening Hanetz at sunrise, it's Yira'ucha im hashemesh, as if we'll daven with the sun. He suggested that if you think about the classic way you would have done that, let's say you're in Bavel and you're facing Eretz Yisrael, which is not to the east but to the west, or let's say you're on Har HaZeitim and you're facing to the west, to Har HaBayit, so you're actually davening with the sun, and you are becoming one with nature, and like several Prakim Tehillim point out, right, we praise God as part of nature, and that's supposed to be the religious experience, but it's not just a once-in-a-lifetime, it's actually the value of Hanetz, which our guys in Yeshiva love, on a daily basis. Not that we always do it, but the opportunity to do it, it sounds, and I think it points to the power of that religious experience.
Yeah, and I guess we'll segue a little bit just in terms of going back to the original question in terms of what's the educational value in terms of these trips. So we spoke about the religious kind of spiritual experience you can have through nature, but another kind of advantage of doing these types of trips is you get to kind of experience some interesting obscure halachic questions. Some of the things that these are like random halachic questions that are never relevant. So I'll give you some examples. So one of my first trips was a cruise from Anchorage, Alaska to Vancouver. So that was my first time in.
I need to get a list from you of all your trips.
I'll do my best over the course of the podcast to throw in a bunch of them. So this was my first time in that area of the world. Before the cruise started, we slept over in Anchorage in the Jewish community, which was basically one family, the Greens. Anyway, so we were davening there, and I'm looking at the times, and I davened mincha at 10:40 p.m., which was like a really fascinating experience. That was like pretty you get some weird davening times and questions. So that's like, again, for us in America, Europe, for most places in Europe, Israel, davening mincha at 10:40 p.m. is bizarre. So that was like a cool type of experience.
Yeah, we had a few of those in Dubai. I remember when we went the first year and we met with the Chabad, and they explained to us the problem of how to make a mikvah in the middle of an ungodly hot desert. Because the year when we went to Abu Dhabi, it was 117 degrees. There isn't exactly water there. And he said that their solution was that they talked to the Chabad Shliach in Siberia, and he had an ice cutter in his shul who cut a glacier that they then schlepped across the ocean on a raft on the sea and take that over to Dubai, then put it on a flatbed truck so that it could be brought to the airport where they had freezers that were big enough, and they gave it armed guards. And we got a shiur on all the complexities of building a mikvah in Dubai, and he taught our guys about the problems of shechita in a very frum Muslim country, because in order to have a shechita house, it had to be also halal l'mahadrin, so he had to say the bracha and Bismillah, but after the bracha. So he had to go back to the 16th century Sephardi poskim to see whether he was allowed to say Bismillah, which just means B'Shem Hashem, after the bracha, or whether it was considered a hefsek and a divide before the shechita. So we definitely saw a lot of those in Dubai, and I think you're right that some of those educational aspects of being forced to think about halachic issues that never come up opens your eyes to the breadth and depth of halachic complexity.
For the listeners that are kind of confused about the truck, so just you forgot to mention it was a special truck because that had to have holes on the bottom.
Yes, it had holes
so
on the
that
bottom.
It wasn't considered a kli because it could technically drip out. So therefore, again, those were the halachic complexities of building a mikvah in a place where there's no rainwater. But going back to davening times, for example, so I topped it. Another trip we went to was Iceland. There's now a Chabad house in Iceland. I was there several years before there was any Chabad, so there was nothing there.
I think when my parents went, I think there might have already been, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. They started these cheap flights, WOW Airlines, which were really cheap flights to Israel, but they had a stopover in Reykjavik, which is the capital of Iceland. So this was a great deal. Iceland is interesting. So just to give a little bit of knowledge for the listeners, in the top of the Americas, there's two quote-unquote areas. There's Iceland and Greenland. They're right next to each other. The reason why they're named such is because Greenland is completely covered in ice and no one lives there. There's only research facilities there. Iceland is this beautiful, lush area. There are glaciers in Iceland, but it's inhabitable, and it's got nice waterfalls and geysers, and it's a beautiful, beautiful country. But it was called Iceland, so the locals didn't want other people trying to come and take over. So it's Iceland, no one would come. Greenland, everyone go to Greenland and they'll find ice. So it's kind of a funny kind of country. But what's interesting halachically is that it's pretty much one of the most northern places where you can have fascinating halachic davening question times without real problems. And what I mean that is basically it's right below the Arctic Circle. So once you get above the Arctic Circle, then you got major challenge, like really problematic challenges in terms of Shabbos and davening, because you have several months during the year where there is no sunrise and sunset, which throws everything out of whack.
I knew someone in Toronto who was a doctor. He would go on behalf of the government to be a doctor in Nunavut. But parts of Nunavut are north of the Arctic Circle, so he wouldn't go in the winter because of the suffix. He'd be stuck in like 6-week Shabbos. So he only went at certain times of the year. I don't think he does that anymore. I think he's the head medical officer in Toronto now. But he used to do that, and he used to tell me about the crazy halachic problems, which is why I was ready for them when one of my students actually went that far and asked me how to keep Shabbos. And I said, please don't be there on Shabbos. Avoid it because it's really hard.
So we went during the summer solstice. which was fascinating because there's about 2-hour gap between sunrise and sunset at that point, to the point that even though there's sunset, after sunset it starts getting dark. It doesn't get actual dark till a little while after sunset, but because there's such little time between sunrise and sunset at that time of year, it doesn't get dark. It's light the entire day. So Shabbos was a fascinating thing there. So we made early Shabbos at like almost midnight. Early Shabbos, okay? And then we weren't sure exactly what time technically, there weren't really Tzesa Kochavim. So we waited about 2 a.m. We figured Shabbos is definitely over at this point. Sunset was probably around 1 a.m., 1:10 a.m., something like that. So I davened Ma'ariv. I made Havdalah. Then we walked around the village, and on Shabbos, we were in this little village, a little out from Reykjavik, which had about a population of 500 people. And on Shabbos afternoon, they had this festival because of the summer solstice. Because if you go this time of year,
not idolatrous.
No. Just
okay. Making sure.
Meaning just celebrating that there's sunlight, right? So because there are other times it's dark most of the day, which is fascinating. When you look in Reykjavik, most of the houses are bright colors to kind of psychologically help improve people's mood during this time of the year when it's dark most of the time. There's sunlight for maybe 4 hours a day. So they have this celebration of there's a lot of sunlight. And then after Shabbos, so we walked around. We took all the pictures my wife wanted that we couldn't take on Shabbos. Walked around for about an hour. Again, this is at 2 a.m. in the morning. It's bright out. And then when we come back to where we were staying, it was 3 a.m., sunrise. I davened Hanetz. It was actually Rosh Chodesh also, so I davened Rosh Chodesh, and then we went to sleep. It was a very wild experience. When you go again, these are kind of the cool theoretical questions that can come up in the Beis Medrash that aren't really theoretical if you go on these trips. Going back to Hawaii, another question one of the years of yeshiva, I gave contemporary halacha class series, and one of the things I did was discuss kind of the crazy travels and their halachic consequences. So one of the things we discussed is the international date line, which is a little more spoken about, but Hawaii is also a big question in terms of how many days of Shabbos you keep, because where exactly is the date line, and do we know, and do you have to keep a Savik? All different opinions. So it's a fascinating discussion, but it's more real when you actually have the opportunity to go experience these things.
Let's move a little bit to some of the more recent trips we've taken and the trip we're taking this year. The last 2 years, following the Abraham Accords, Yeshiva went to Dubai last year during the World Expo. And this year we're going to Bahrain. I'm just going to turn it over to you and for your reflections on why we made the decision to really travel and try to understand the reality on the ground with the Abraham Accords and what that's done for our students, what other people could or should learn from what we saw in our experiences there. For me, it was a life-changing experience, but I'm going to turn it to you because, like I said, you organized it and you've thought about this a lot more than I have.
Yeah, so after the first trip, the sponsors approached us and said they are interested in continuing the relationship and continuing to sponsor an annual kind of out-of-the-box international experience, life-changing experience. At the time, if you remember, so it was the height of COVID, there were entry permits and travel bans and COVID testing and vaccinations and all these very complicated things, and the rules were changing in every country. I
remember how many pages of paperwork we had to upload and the team of testers at the airport in Dubai.
It was not simple, I'll tell you that. And when they first told us that they wanted to do another trip, Rabbi Ginsburg told me that we're looking into another trip. I kind of laughed. I'm like, there's no way we're doing a trip. Anyway, so the sponsors suggested, it was right after the Abraham Accords, what about Dubai? Just because you have a sponsor for a trip doesn't mean you should go, right? So I really thought about what the educational purpose of this trip was. Most people, when they think about Dubai, now Dubai's a little bit more on the map, and people think touristy, fun, exotic.
Which it is that also.
Of course it is, but I'll explain why, but I'll give you at the end of the first trip, I did a survey of all the participants asking about the trip, how it went, because it was also my first time really from beginning to end, nuts, bolts, running the entire trip, logistics and bookings and everything and planning. And the last question I asked was multiple choice question, and you have to choose one answer. If you had to classify the trip, how would you classify it? Fun, educational, or eye-opening? This was an anonymous survey, every single person who filled out the survey said eye-opening. There is a lot for us as religious Jews to learn from our cousins in Dubai. And so pedagogically, what makes our yeshiva stand out in terms of the things we focus on is I think we have a lot of guys that are philosophically inclined, as seen on this podcast. So that
focus on the big questions, as we like to call them.
Correct.
At yeshiva.
We focus on the big questions, philosophy, theology, and we're a little more open than, let's say, your typical traditional yeshiva in terms of what questions we're going to ask and what sources of information we're going to look to kind of help understand God's world. And when you go to Dubai and you look at Islam, there's a lot we have in common. And there are certain things that I'm sorry to say that they do better than us, and we have what to learn and improve upon. And I'll give two examples. One of the biggest challenges in the Jewish day school system, and I think in the modern Orthodox world, is tefillah, davening. And there is reason for that is because basically, if you go historically how our structured tefillah developed, so you go back to the Gemara, there's basically two models of where tefillah comes from. Gemara Brachos talks about whether it's from the Avos or the Korbanos. Each of the forefathers, Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, established one of the set prayers, Shachris, Mincha, and Mariv. And the second opinion is basically, no, it's to replace the Korbanos, the sacrificial service in the temple, in the Beis HaMikdash, that we cannot do anymore. And so a lot of the rigidity of tefillah that we have now in terms of its structure, you say this, so you have to do this at this moment, at this time, is basically replacing that service. And when you think about those two models of tefillah, it represents the rigidity, the sacrificial, basically God is instructing, this is how you serve me, and this is the procedure to do, and you have to follow it. That's what the Korbanos were. And especially as we get more Western and less rigid as a society, that's very challenging for people. The other model of tefillah is this spontaneity, kind of what we spoke about at the beginning of the podcast, that like inspirational, spiritual experience that you have connecting to God. And that's what drove Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov to basically come up with their prayers on their own. Those two elements are both present in tefillah, but a lot in halacha, in terms of what you have to do, when you have to do it, is stressed more. Not that it's not important, but a lot of people have a trouble connecting with that and prefer just the spontaneity and the free verse, so to speak, that the forefathers represented.
Before you go on, I'll just note that the Yerushalmi is a third position that identifies the times of tefillah as a response to the rhythm of the natural world, which connects to some of the things we talked about earlier, where tefillah is, at its best, a response to actual lived experience. But, okay, continue.
Yeah, and so I think coupled by the fact that we'll talk about the America Jewish day school system, most of them don't speak Hebrew. And even though we have 12 years of Hebrew education, they don't come out understanding the language. So there's a big language barrier. Plus, again, the modern notion of like, I can do whatever I want. Why should I have to say these words at this time? I'd rather just say, yeah, God understands what I just want to say whatever I want to God. Now, there is value and importance to the structure, but people connect more with the spontaneity. When you go to Dubai, the emphasis of prayer and the importance of prayer is seen in a way that we do not see it here. I'll give you a few examples of that. Big things and small things. Number one of the top tourist attractions is the Grand Mosque, and it's this stunning, stunning building. I've been to the Vatican. I'll throw another one in there. That's a separate halachic question. But I've been
on the mosque question, you should know we had a discussion about this, but Ray Ginsburg and I and a few others, we felt very strongly like Rav Ovadia that it's permitted to go into a mosque, as they're monotheists as well. I remember when we went to the mosque and we looked around at the structure, Ray Ginsburg's first response was, where did we go wrong? Why can't we build shuls like this? The answer might be we don't have several $1 billion lying around, but we'll leave that on the side.
Right. I think it also touches on the significance of the Beis HaMikdash and how we don't, like, that's another
That was the first thing I thought.
Right. So in terms of, like, we don't want to replace the Beis HaMikdash and as a majestic building, the Beis HaMikdash, Gemara describes, if you never saw the Beis HaMikdash, you never saw a beautiful building in your life. But when you go to the Grand Mosque in Abu Dhabi, which we threw out a few names, just give some of the listeners a little bit of background information so they know what we're talking about. Dubai is not a country, right? And the country is the United Arab Emirates. Kind of the face of the United Arab Emirates has
to the outside world.
To the outside world has become Dubai. Now, the United Arab Emirates in the 1970s, 7 emirates, basically different areas, kind of combined to become one country. And there are some countries in the area, actually, like Qatar, for example, that were potential candidates to join the Emirates, but chose not to become their own countries. So there are 7 Emirates. The most famous 2 of the 7 are one, Dubai, which has become the top tourism capital and kind of very comparable to Tel Aviv, business, high-tech, startup, and tourism. That's their main industry. And the capital, which is Abu Dhabi, where the equivalent of the federal government sits, etc. So the Grand Mosque is in Abu Dhabi, and you go there and you just can't help but feel, and I feel motivation to say this and inspiration to say, and not that this is like heresy, but when you go there for the first time, I really had an image, a picture of what, when I say that God should build the Beis HaMikdash every day in my tefillos, I had an image in my mind because it was a beautiful, stunning building. I felt the presence of God.
And it brings people from all over the world to appreciate that.
Exactly. And everyone is welcome, right? And it's basically, and that's what the Beis HaMikdash is supposed to be. And there are different permissions for Muslims and non-Muslims, but everyone respects that. And no one's has a problem with that. There's a certain yira that is in that place, and you have to, and they have staff all over the place. It's like the Kohanim and the Leviim. It's in their robes, and you really feel it. And again, it gives you a real, talking about again these traveling experience that make certain aspects of the Beis Medrash of Jewish life become a reality and an experiential experience.
I mean, I think you're right, but I don't think it's just the big experiences. I know that when we were there the first year, seeing when we went to that mosque/educational center, seeing that they have a Zmanim clock, just like you have in every shul, I think for our students showed the universality of prayer and of the structure. And they saw, it's not just us. This is actually something that makes sense broadly. And also the fact that, as you mentioned, that first year there were heavy COVID restrictions, and they yelled at us every time we congregated in groups of more than 3 or 4 in the mall, except when we wanted to daven mincha, if we went to the prayer room, they let us convene because tefillah was so important to them that they allowed joining with masks and whatever, but if you were in the prayer room, you were allowed to congregate because they felt that couldn't be taken away. And seeing how, on the one hand, they were so strict about any gathering, right? We were just gathering off the bus, just telling everyone directions, and they yelled at us. But then when I brought a bunch of guys to daven mincha there, and they let us gather there, and you saw how much importance they gave to tefillah, I think that for our students, it did ignite that passion because, well, they can be so serious, why can't we? Or we should be.
Yeah. They didn't yell at us, which is also I want to talk about. That's the
You're
second
right. They
thing
don't
I
yell. They're very civil.
I want to talk about that as a second point, so we'll come back to that in a second. But the importance and the connection to prayer is significant there. It's not just in the mosque, which is obvious, which we spoke about, but again, the fact that every public area has prayer rooms, has designated prayer rooms. So you go to the Dubai Mall, the largest mall in the world, basically capital of the world of basically every single store you want is in there.
It's not just stores. For those who want to go to Dubai, it also has an aquarium and a zoo and ice skating and God knows what in the mall itself.
Yeah, so everything that should make it the most non-spiritual place you could step foot in, it has, but yet on every floor, there are multiple prayer rooms. That is significant. And prayer, and I think part of the reason is because they've kind of kept true to the Avos model of tefillah, where their tefillah takes, they daven 5 times a day, but it's not an hour-long experience. It's not like a shacharis with laning and kriyas Torah and whatever. It's primarily a personal prayer and very few scripted verses you're supposed to say, which are taken from the Quran. The prayer sounds like most of us are familiar with. It's a call to prayer, right? It's not the prayer. It's the call to prayer. It's saying you pray, right? Not here is the textbook. Go. This is the words you should say. So I think that's one of the reasons why they connect with that. And we have to find, not to say we should get rid of all the korbanos aspects. It's important because we have to remember that there's the special nature of the Beis HaMikdash in Yerushalayim, but we have to not lose that avos aspect in our everyday prayers. The other idea, just to close out the prayer idea, is in the small things as well. And I don't know why Israel can't do this. Something we can learn from them. So you go into any hotel in Dubai, and I pointed this out to the students, and most tourists don't even know this. They'll go and they'll have a great time and they'll leave. Every hotel, in the room, there's a little tiny sticker with an arrow to the Kaaba. For those that don't know what the Kaaba is, right? Kaaba is basically the direction which they pray towards Mecca. We pray towards Yerushalayim. The Kaaba is the direction they pray towards Mecca, which is significant for Islam and Muhammad, etc. So the fact that the tourism industry is just so, it's a given. You go to these fancy resorts and they have the bars and all these things, but yet...
And you don't have to ask, which way is Mizrach or whatever.
Right, exactly. So when we were there, when it was time to daven whatever we were praying, I would look at the sticker and then I'd adjust basically from where we are in the world towards Yerushalayim. But the idea, like, why can't Israel have that? Why can't every hotel in Israel, the Jewish state, right, just have a simple
Orient
sticker?
Our tourism around Tefillah or
right,
around Yerushalayim.
Right, just have a little Yerushalayim sticker in the hotel. This way to Yerushalayim, and all the hotels in Yerushalayim, this way to the old city.
I think this should be your next project.
So I think it's a very small thing, but it speaks volumes in terms of the significance.
Okay, so you said they didn't yell, which I remember. You're right, they didn't yell. Why did you insist on correcting me on that point?
Oh, so the other, I think, very significant value that we can take away from that experience is kind of the derech eretz that they have as a country, which is something I think Israel as a country has much to work on.
Not to be motzi la'az on Israelis.
This is a constructive criticism. It's you got to give tochacha. So I'm going to tell you the experience, the traumatic experience we had last year. So we went to Dubai twice. So last year's trip, the second Dubai trip, in the news, people may be familiar with, there was kind of like a disagreement between Israel security forces or body and the Dubai airport, which led to about a week or two before our scheduled flight to Dubai of limited flights and seemingly haphazardly random flights being canceled and one flight being let through. Anyway, it was very nerve-wracking running the trip. I can't have a trip that just like runs smoothly without maybe
God forbid.
Right. So hopefully this next trip will be smooth, clean, no complications. So I'm working on seeing if we're going to go. We have to make a decision. Finally, the deadline for this disagreement was basically the Thursday before our trip. All the social media outlets in Israel posted, it's been resolved, no more canceled flight. Wonderful. We get to the airport and there's a 2-hour delay, a quote-unquote computer malfunction, although I see that there are other flights to other places from the same computers being let through. So the computers were clearly working. Anyway, we get through. It wasn't so bad. We get to Dubai. We get to the hotel. I have a flight guy that I arranged the flights with. He sends me a WhatsApp. You made it okay? I said, yeah. He's like, I have good news and bad news. The good news is, out of the 4 flights scheduled for Israel, yours is the only one that went through. The bad news is that the return flight for Thursday is already canceled. So that began this literally epic movie-worthy story, which it was so good that I actually made it into the Perm Spiel that year, and it was 95% true, which included figuring out how to escape Dubai, because the challenges were staying for Shabbos would double the budget of the trip, which we didn't have, and there were no flights available, and what were we going to do? So we had to figure out food, we had to figure out possibly getting back, and I had to run the trip at the same time. So I had I literally created a WhatsApp group called Escape Dubai, and we had...
yes, I was part of it, because I was the ones waiting for them for Shabbos on the other side.
Yeah, so basically, what ended up happening is that, long story short, we'll skip to the end, is that they rescheduled us. We were supposed to fly Thursday. They rescheduled us for a Friday 12 p.m. flight, which at the time there were a 2-hour difference. We'd have as long as left on time, we'd have a several-hour buffer in terms of Shabbos. We're mid-check-in, and everything seems fine. Then all of a sudden, there's a 2-hour delay. We're leaving at 2 p.m. Through the trip, I got a lot of different numbers of different people, including Shabak operatives and whatever. So they said, as long as it's scheduled on time, you're going to be okay. Basically, we load the plane, and we don't take off till, even though we're supposed to take off at 2, till 3:30, okay? Which gives us about everything going smoothly, maybe half an hour to... And there are big halachic questions in terms of what we were going to do. But basically half an hour to get off the plane and get on to the buses before Shkia, which would allow us to, and we had a non-Jewish driver to drive us to Modi'in, and myself and Rabbi Ginsburg back to where we needed to go. And it was a very stressful few hours. And as we're taking off, I'm working on making sure that the buses are already there. We had backup plans in Dubai because we have to get off the plane. And the reaction of the two different countries was glaring. So I'll give you some examples. We tried to get an exemption for the COVID testing, and we tried to figure out, and we got a connection, and we got the one person that could approve it. And because this is Shabbos, right? We don't want to violate Shabbos. So in the terms of the religious importance, and the one person that could approve it was on vacation in America. So that wasn't happening. In Dubai, they were turning over backwards to accommodate us and say, no problem, you're not going to have to violate Shabbat. In Israel, as an institution, they didn't really care, okay? On the plane, I was explaining to each of the students exactly what the protocol was going to be. Leave your bags. You're going to have maybe half an hour. I prepped them in advance. Have your COVID document ready. Or you have your COVID test scanner ready. And then you have to run to the bus and get on the bus. There was another group on the plane. It was a trip to kind of like promote the Abraham Accords, to kind of build a connection between the two countries. And they were telling me a little bit about their trip, and they did all the touristy things. It was a very touristy trip. Basically, we had asked the flight attendants to announce and request most of them were not Shomer Shabbos, to request that anyone who is not Shomer Shabbat should please let the Shomer Shabbat people off first because of the urgency of Shabbos. And they announced it on the plane, and they said, please just sit in your seats until we arrive at the gate. Do not get up until we arrive at the gate. So as soon as we're almost touching the ground, so many of them magically became Shomer Shabbat and start jumping up and trying to get their stuff. And the attendants request multiple times for them to sit down, and they don't listen, to the point where they actually stop the plane on the runway till they all sit down. At that point, I lost it, and all my students were sitting. One tried to stand up, and I told them to sit down. But at this point, I stood up and in Hebrew yelled at the entire plane. And basically, the gist of it was, you saw all the creations of Ben Adam, the castles and the palaces and the Burj Khalifa and all the amazing things that Ben Adam can create. But you missed the most important thing to learn from Dubai, which is how to act like a Ben Adam. Everyone sit down. Chil Hashem. Everyone sat down, and then we went through, and Baruch Hashem, we made it to the minute onto the bus. It was a record. Shkia was 5:45. That's something that we can really, really learn from our cousin Dubai as a society, of this, A, the importance of becoming a religious state, more so, and B, the niceties and derech eretz that you can have to another person.
Okay, so there's definitely more we could talk about, and we didn't even get to talk about this year's trip to Bahrain. But I think we've talked about a lot of important things about using travel as an opportunity to see the greatness of Hashem's creation, of learning from other cultures, what it can tell us about our own religious lives, our own ethical lives. And hopefully that this has encouraged people to realize that learning isn't just about reading books and listening to shiurim, but it's also about going places and seeing things and seeing people and embracing all that is great about the world that God has created and that man has created.
Thanks for having me. Also, from these experiences, I've started branching out to organizing group travel. I did a group from Toronto, so if you're interested, you can reach out to me and we can speak. awesometravelrav@gmail.com.
So really, thank you for it. I know we could go on for hours. Feel free to reach out either through our website at migdalhatorah.org or our email podcast@migdalhatorah.org. Subscribe to our monthly podcast on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts. Looking forward to hearing from you and continuing the conversation.